Blue-White Breakdown is back. The first one of March. I'm Bob Flounders, joined as always by Greg Pickel on PennLive's Penn State football podcast. You can get it in a bunch of different ways. We have a video version of it. We have a pure podcast version of it. We have our man Joe Hermit working behind the scenes to produce it, minus theme music, which is still a sticking point, Greg, as we get into early March. But to me, early March means hopefully February and the snow are about to go away. St. Patty's Day, in some way, shape, or form, is right around the corner. So is March Madness, whatever it's going to look like. We're talking about baseball, but we're here, Greg, to talk about Penn State football. And in the last week or so, there's been some significant recruiting news. None of it, if you judge each piece of the news, on its own, none of it major, but a lot of, I think, interesting points, news points that has Penn State trending up a little bit when it comes to recruiting the Lions. The 2021 class, I don't think was by any means what Penn State wanted. They're off to a good start, though, in 2022 early on. And there's been some news in the last couple of days that I think is positive if you are James Franklin and his staff, and if you're also a Penn State football fan. So why don't you just run us through, Greg? First of all, I hope you're doing well. Why don't you just run us through maybe the one or two top things maybe the fan base can kind of focus on and what they mean maybe for the 2022 class and beyond?
Yeah, Bob, it's interesting because these guys still cannot take in-person visits. That's still off the table because of the NCAA dead period, which is now going to last all the way through May. And we're hoping at this point that, those visits the camps and all that stuff can start up again in June and kind of carry us through to the start of summer camp. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it has been a little bit newsier than normal over the last couple of days. I mean, let's start with the staff edition that kind of popped up last Friday, a couple different places. Kenny Sanders is someone who I think those who follow recruiting closely know well. He's a guy that was on James Franklin's recruiting staff for a couple of years, left in 2019 to take a promotion and become the director of recruiting at Oregon, which was kind of the role that Andy Frank has long held at Penn State ever since James Franklin's been here. So Kenny Sanders was there for a year and he left Oregon and now is back at Penn State. So he's a guy who really connects well with kids, Bob. He really does a good job of, I think, getting to know the players and the parents in a way that it's not that the coaches can't get them to know this way, but in that way, but they obviously have a lot of other stuff going on, especially during the season. So when you talk about these recruiting department staffers who kind of bridge the gap, Kenny Sanders is as good as anybody in the country at doing that. So I thought that was an important rehire, I guess you could say, by James Franklin and co. Get him back in here. He's well respected. He has a ton of connections, and he can only help Penn State continue to grow this class of 2022 that is really off to a good start, even if it's hit a bit of a lull here. And I know that through our tech subscribers, some of the questions we've received have sort of focused on an idea that what's going on. Penn State got out to such a hot start. There really hasn't been much in the way of new commitments or anything even close to it of late. They lost Holden Stays, the tight end, when Tyler Bowen left for the NFL. So there's some, I don't want to say hand-wringing, but, we're at that point of the year, Bob, where I think a lot of people are wondering what's going on. Why is there not more news out there? And I think it's because of that lack of visits. I really do. I think we're going to see, as you mentioned, some kids start cutting their list and start getting a little bit more serious about focusing in on a select number of schools, but I'll be hard-pressed to believe that we're going to see a ton of commitments like we did at this time last year, just because these guys, unlike their predecessors, know what's on the horizon, right? They know that these visits are going to start back up again. We all expect that the regular season is going to kind of play out in a much more normal way than in the past. So I think we're in a bit of a lull here, but, I think you've seen in recent days, Penn State kind of pick things up with Nick Singleton, the running back out of Governor Mifflin, one of the top players in PA. You know, the list of quarterbacks, there's a few of them that they're going to target outside of Bo Prabula, who of course has long been committed. But Drew Allar out of Medina, Ohio is one guy I think you need to keep a close eye on. Picked up a 4-star recently, and Notre Dame entered his recruitment. He's a guy Penn State and Mike Yurcich have been high on for a couple of months now. AJ Duffy at IMG Academy, most think he's going to join the Fighting Brennemans and the Sun Devils at Arizona State, but Penn State did make his top 4. And then Nick Evers is a kid out of Texas, Bob, that Mike Yurcich started recruiting when he was with the Longhorns. So you're right. Things are starting to come into focus a little bit more, but at the same time, it's still going to be a little bit blurry, I think, just simply because of the fact that Penn State is sort of waiting on a lot of guys to make decisions. And a lot of these guys, I think, want to make visits before they're going to do that.
Real quick, who is the most exciting name on the list of the guys you mentioned, whether it's Penn State making the cut to the top Final 5 or Final 6, and who is maybe the most realistic guy? Like you said, it's early, but you mentioned Mike Yurcich has some ties to the Penn State's new offensive coordinator, has some ties to one of the kids. Can you kind of marry maybe an exciting kid with maybe Penn State being a legit contender for his services? Or is it just too early to do that? Because I know a lot. You look at the list, Greg, and it's great that Penn State's on the list or a finalist, but all the other schools are just national power. So is there anyone that Penn State fans should maybe feel really good about, whether it's because of Mike Yurcich's presence, or you mentioned some in-state kids, but is there one name that's got to kind of has your interest?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're right that, at this point they are kind of they're kind of in a place, Bob, where they're, to get where they want to go, they have to be mentioned among all of these heavy hitters.
Yeah.
But let's be honest, that makes it really difficult to land kids a lot of the times. And Penn State's run into that problem before. So when you talk about kind of the top, the kids cutting their list of top schools, let me transition to defense quick. Jaden Gold's a 4-star corner out of New Jersey. Penn State, Michigan, USC, Notre Dame, Clemson, and Rutgers made his top 6. I believe that was last week. That came out late last week. But, he's a guy who's interesting. And let's be honest, Penn State has not had roaring success in New Jersey for a couple of cycles now for whatever reason. So I think he's one to keep a close eye on. And then on offense, I mean, you can go a number of different ways with who you think is the guy that is most important for them to get. I sort of land on Nick Singleton for a couple of reasons. One, we've noted Penn State's had some struggles with getting the best players in Pennsylvania to stay in Pennsylvania and at Penn State over the last few cycles. They're fighting hard for the top player, Anaya White from Imhotep Charter. He's a defensive lineman. But when you flip to the other side of the ball, you have Mekhi Flowers, you have Anthony Ivy, you have Bo Prabula. So you like what you have there. But I think with Singleton, he's a guy who's going to change someone's program in a really good way. There's been a lot of good info out there about his junior season and how he improved off of that junior season. And, for Penn State, Bob, they didn't get a running back in the last class out of high school. They got John Lovett through the transfer portal. But to me, they're at a point now where they must not only get someone, but get someone who's really good, really talented, and can come sort of carry the load, because you're not going to have Noah Cain and Devin Ford forever. And obviously Keziah Holmes and Kevon Lee got a lot of run last year, and that could speed up their possible NFL timelines. And you're talking maybe a year from now or 2 years from now, I guess those guys may be looking at the NFL and not another year in college. So it's time to go put to work that great running back past you've had under James Franklin. And to me, that means getting Singleton in this class.
Sure. Let's move it along to the coaching side. We've talked in recent editions about some assistants that I think have been added. Most recently, Anthony Poindexter, the Purdue safeties coach, and I think he was the co-defensive coordinator. He's in the same role largely at Penn State to replace Tim Banks. But maybe these moves don't get enough attention, but James Franklin has kind of filled in 2 analyst positions, I believe, on the offensive side. One I'm very familiar with because I can remember you were I think you were still a teenager, Greg, when the name Danny O'Brien first made the rounds at Penn State. I think it was early in Bill O'Brien's brief regime at Penn State. He was looking to pad his quarterback class, and I believe Danny O'Brien was an attractive transfer portal. I don't know. It wasn't a transfer portal. Grad transfer, I think it was at that time. He was an attractive grad transfer quarterback candidate, I believe from Maryland. He caused a stir, I think, when he visited Penn State, and Penn State fans thought they were going to get him. I think he ended up going somewhere else. It might have been Wisconsin. I can't remember. But his college career never really blossomed the way a lot of people thought it would. But I bring that up because he's now, I believe, an offensive analyst on James Franklin's staff. And they've also added an offensive analyst with NFL ties. And I think that's significant. And maybe, Greg, you can speak to both of the additions and what they mean, but especially getting a guy with NFL ties in the offensive analyst position.
Yeah, so when you mentioned Danny O'Brien, you're right. He was they had hoped that he was going to join the McGloin, Rob Bolden, and I think Paul Jones was still around at that point. I think you're right. They were hoping to get him in. And if I remember correctly, a lot of people were thinking that he was going to be kind of the next Russell Wilson-like guy in terms of transferring after having some success and really thriving at his next school. And in that kind of vein, he ended up at Wisconsin. You're right. Things didn't go so well there. I think he actually ended up transferring again from Wisconsin to somewhere else. You know, James Franklin had a familiarity with him because they were at Maryland at the same time. And he was coaching for a CFL league team, if I'm not mistaken. So they pluck him out of there for this analyst role. And I guess the long and the short of it is when you talk about this and when you talk about Loggins, who the former New York Jets offensive coordinator under Adam Gase, who has never coached in college before, but is now going to take an off-field analyst role with the Lions as well. I think you just see James Franklin buffing up that support staff, which that's what everybody else is doing these days. I think Alabama has 9 off-field analysts, Bob. I think Ohio State has like 6. And so this is kind of the way things are going. And I think for, O'Brien, it's a stepping stone opportunity, right? It's a chance for him to take kind of the same path that Ty Howell did, which is go from position coach at a lower level to, I guess you can call the CFL a lower level, but to analyst at a Power 5 program to one-day position coach. That's what Ty Howell did, and I'm sure Danny O'Brien wants to do the same thing. And then with Loggins, it almost feels to me like that's kind of the new career reset, right? That if things maybe didn't go so well over the last couple of years and you're not really getting too many job opportunities to do what you had been doing, then you do this analyst thing, and all of a sudden, then a year or two down the road, there's all kinds of opportunities.
Everyone forgets, and you get a fresh slate.
That's right. So, I'm sure that there are some ties between him and James Franklin's staff that aren't clear on the surface, but there must be some kind of connection to bring him in to work in that kind of behind-the-scenes role with Mike Yurcich and company. So, but ultimately, again, I think that we're seeing more and more college teams, especially the better ones, really beef up their analyst departments and their off-field departments. And this is just another way Penn State's trying to go about doing that.
All right. We're at least halfway through this Blue-White Breakdown podcast. I'm Bob Flounders, talking with Greg Pickel. Greg, since we're about halfway through, just tell the audience what they can do, where they can find us, how they can find us, if they want to review us and give us 5 stars or 4 stars, or even like 1 or 2 stars. I guess we can live with it. But just tell the audience if there's any changes. We had Dave Jones on the podcast last week. Hopefully we'll have him back probably next week, maybe for a special St. Patty's Day edition. Who knows what we're going to do, Greg? We're just spitballing right now. But how can the fan base continue to watch, rate, review, all of that good stuff when it comes to the Blue-White Breakdown?
Yeah, you got it, Bob. The Blue White Breakdown, the extended version, the daily version from Dustin Hockensmith. You can find it wherever you get your audio. So that's Google, Stitcher, Spotify, Apple. If they have podcasts, if you get podcasts there, you will find us. Then the video version, youtube.com/all Penn State.
Okay, so let's change it up and let's tilt the conversation a little bit, Greg, uh, towards spring practice. And before we talk about spring practice, one of the great indicators of spring in general is Punxsutawney Phil and Groundhog Day, and whether or not he sees a shadow. Legend has it, if he sees a shadow, it's either 6 weeks of bad news or 6 weeks of good news. People are riveted by that stuff in Pennsylvania. If you're a Penn State football fan, it's the winter workouts and the stars of the winter workouts on social media. You will see a position coach kind of give a nod to maybe the guy that's best leading the position group, whether it's linebackers, whether it's running backs, whether it's offensive linemen or quarterbacks. Usually that's a pretty good indicator that they're doing very well in Dwight Galt's winter conditioning program. Penn State's currently doing that. Greg, I know you're following it. I'm following it. Why don't we just touch on a couple of names that we've consistently seen, maybe more than once? I've got one. I know you probably had the same name, but there are a couple of guys that look like they are really doing well at this time of year, whether it comes to the conditioning part, which is a big part, especially now that we know there is going to be a spring practice. We don't know when it's going to be, and I'm sure I'm jinxing it because the minute we do this podcast, Penn State's going to have its starting date. But Greg, just a couple of names that have caught your eye on social media with regard to the Penn State assistant coaches maybe praising some current Nittany Lions.
Yeah, it's interesting, Bob, because if you look over these throughout the years, it's been a way at times for them to kind of recognize some guys that are off the radar a little bit, walk-ons or new players, or, I think you could obviously probably give this kind of a thing to a Sean Clifford or someone like that, someone prominent in the program every single workout, but it's a way to get some guys some recognition and some kudos on social media that maybe aren't used to that kind of thing or don't, hear their name called out in public all the time at news conferences or things like that. But the one that's really caught my eye is I believe John Lovett has twice won this award from J1 Sider. And, it really seems to me that they brought him in not only because he could play and because he knows what a college football program is like, but also because they are missing that kind of veteran presence in that room since Journey Brown, as from the on-field perspective anyway. Journey Brown's still around, but unfortunately the health issue with the heart condition took him off the field. But, I think that what they wanted him to do is come in and help these younger guys, even though these younger guys have played a good bit, and sort of show them the ropes of what he's learned after a pretty good college career to date. So that's been probably the most interesting one to me, Bob. There was a wide receiver, Ben Wilson, who I'm pretty sure he was a walk-on. I can't remember if he transferred in or if he just generally walked on, but we've seen his name a couple of times too. And again, this is not necessarily a predictive tool in terms of what we're going to see in the fall, but that wide receiver room, I don't think there's any doubt that there's opportunity there. You have Jahan Dotson, you have Keandre Lambert-Smith, you have Parker Washington, you have some other guys, but it's not, I don't think that's certainly a position, as we saw with Dan Chisena not too long ago, that maybe a guy who wasn't recruited or didn't have stars out of high school can come in and find himself a role. And maybe Ben Wilson's that guy this year.
Yeah. John Lovett, the Baylor Bear, who did some really good things. His 2020, if you look at his stat sheet at Baylor, he's got a lot of impressive years. The 2020 numbers for Penn State fans, they're not going to jump out at you. He didn't play as much. Baylor didn't play as much. The numbers don't jump off the charts. But if you look at what he did in 19, I think in 18, he's a very productive player at Baylor. He's got intriguing size. He is a veteran. And you're right, Greg. He was one that caught my eye. Another name that caught my eye, and I think he's a pretty interesting guy at Penn State this year, is Keaton Nellis. I think he's gotten praise multiple times, I think, from Terry Smith. Keaton Nellis has excellent size. I think he has, if they ever wanted to move him, they could. I think he's got ideal size to play corner. Entering his third year, state college, high school grad. Penn State was on him early, and he wasn't really viewed, I think, in recruiting circles as a big-time prospect. But I think as he finished his senior year, he got better and better, and I think other schools probably warmed up to him. By that time, he was already a Penn State Nittany Lion. He's played some significant football at Penn State. Played as a true freshman. I think he was dealing with some injury issues last year because he didn't play in all of the games. But this is an important guy, Greg. I think he's a guy that can push to start. I think the corner hierarchy is Tariq Castro-Fields and Joey Porter Jr., and then it's Keaton Ellis and Marquise Wilson and Daquan Hardy. And we don't know about Johnny Dixon from South Carolina, who was a transfer portal addition. But you know what? Good health has not been necessarily guaranteed to a player like Tariq Castro-Fields at Penn State. Second half of 2019, he was dealing with an issue. He tried to play through it. Last year, I think he played in maybe 2 or 3 games tops, and then he couldn't play the rest of the year. He did come back, and I think obviously he's viewed as a starter. But, Greg, if anything happens to any of the top 2 guys, I think Keaton Nellis fits in very nicely for Penn State. And the other thing I would say is, in today's football, you're probably playing 3 corners more often than you're not on the field, or an extra defensive back. So I think that third corner is very, very valuable at Penn State. And it feels to me like if Keaton is healthy in 2021, I think Penn State might look his way a lot.
Yeah, I think that, Bob, he's a guy that we were all kind of confused why he didn't play more early last year. Yeah. And then whether it was health, whether it was something else, he certainly saw his snap count increase as they experienced some injuries on that side of the ball. And, yeah, he does feel to me like a guy who, not that he hasn't made his mark yet, because he was really good as a freshman and he wasn't bad last year, albeit, again, there were the questions about why he didn't play as much. And you have Tariq Castro-Fields back, you have Dixon in, but you're right. I mean, they were playing. Remember at one point, James Franklin suggested today, it was either James Franklin or Terry Smith. I wish I can remember, but I don't. But for more or less said they had like 2.5, 3.5 corners available at most. Right. And you're talking about trying to play 3 in a defensive package, and that's really all they had available, period, on game day. So you're right. The more they can get healthy over there, the better. And that room has a chance to be a strength for them. And you're right, Keaton Ellis, if it is, will probably be among the guys that lead the way.
Okay. Let's close up with 2 things real quick. Greg, there's not going to be, as we know it, a traditional version or any kind of version of the NFL scouting combine this year due to the ongoing pandemic. Even though things are looking up, the combine is usually, it would have been over by now, I think, or just ending right now in Indianapolis. In recent years, some Penn State players have tested very well at the combine and really improved their draft status. There won't be a combine per se. I think a lot of it will be some kind of regional workouts or maybe individual workouts, depending on how good the prospect is. But that didn't stop the NFL from saying, well, had there have been a combine, these players would have been invited. It's actually, it's a nice little feather in the cap because they don't invite just anyone. It's a set number of prospects. Greg, there were 6 Penn State players on this year's scouting combine list. I know that I know them. I'm sure that you know most of them. But when you look at the list, a half dozen guys, I don't know if all of them will be drafted. I think all of them I think you could see all of them be drafted, but there's at least one name on that list that I think that has a little bit of work to do. I think if he's going to see his name called on draft day in the NFL, versatile player, offensive lineman, that's Will Fries. But let's go through the rest of the list real quick. I don't think there's a lot of surprises, but Greg, I just wonder, had there been a scouting combine, there are a couple names on this list that had a chance to be the stars of the combine. So take it away.
Yeah, so it was Micah Parsons, Jason Oweh, Pat Fryermuth, Michael Bennett, Shaka Toney, and as you mentioned, Will Fries. I guess my big takeaway from this, Bob, and you make a good point that a couple of these Penn State guys would have been among the show stealers had there been an NFL combine. But, when you mention guys like Will Fries and Shaka Toney and Michael Bennett and some of the Penn State guys who did not receive combine invites, whatever that means this year, but who are going to be at Pro Day, what an opportunity for them to get a chance to work out in front. I have to think all 32 teams are going to send people to State College for Pro Day, which is March 25. With that much top end talent there, you would assume, especially everyone's going to want to get a look at Parsons. These guys are going to want to see Fryman's going to want to see, but they're not just there to see those guys. They're going to watch and get measurables and stuff on everyone. So unlike in years past where maybe Penn State's top end talent wasn't this good in terms of the draft, maybe you only get 20 teams to show up or 22 teams to show up, or maybe it's a lower level scout and not one of your top scouts or your GM or something, or a head coach, so I think my big takeaway for this Pro Day, look, we know that Parsons, these guys are going to put on shows. It's going to be impressive. But to me, when we look back on where Penn State's guys ultimately end up in the draft, I don't think there's any question, Bob, that some of them may have a chance to go higher than what we think they could, based on the fact that more NFL people are going to have eyes on this Pro Day. And maybe they catch a guy who they don't know as much about, but they see him work out or they interview him and decide to move him up their list. So I think it's good for, these 6 guys you mentioned, obviously, are, the quote unquote cream of the crop of this year's Penn State draft class. But I think some other guys could see their stock go up, not obviously huge, but maybe you go from undrafted to a late round pick, or maybe you go from not being a priority undrafted free agent signing to a priority for somebody. So I think some guys will benefit from these superstars of what this Penn State Pro Day will have.
Real quick on the combine, I don't know that it's a guarantee that all these guys are going to show up in State College. Micah Parsons is on the West Coast. I mean, guys have scattered. You hope that all of them would come back, but we'll have to wait and see who's going to actually come back to State College. And the names you mentioned to me, Greg, I think you're right. When you're talking about a list of guys where at least 3 of them, I think Penn State has 2 legitimate, because Micah Parsons is a first round pick. But I think Jason Oweh is definitely in the first round conversation. The more that the season has the more that we've moved away for 2020, it feels like Pat Frymuth is now in the second round conversation, not the first round conversation. But when you have 3 athletes of that level, I do think you're going to see one of the bigger attendance pools for Penn State, depending on what other workouts are that day. But, you want to see those 3 guys for different reasons. Micah Parsons opted out. So scouts just want to see him what he looks like. Did he put good weight on? What's that 40 time looking like? He hasn't played since December of 2019. Jason Oweh hasn't played much football, period. Everyone has heard the rumors about how he is the freakiest freak of the freaks at Penn State. Seeing it's going to be believed. I, for one, would love to see him go through those drills. I know the 40 times for a defensive end just isn't that important anymore, Greg. It's more about 10 yards, 20 yards. But we've seen him. He is an unbelievable athlete, and I think that he would definitely be someone that I think the NFL is gathering more information on. And Freiermuth, he had the surgery. How did he come back from the surgery? Is he limited? Is there anything he can't do going into the draft? What was the surgery? And finally, Greg, even a guy like Shaka Toney, I think he's a very a player that guys want to see. The guy was named first team All Big Ten. He's kind of a tweener size-wise, right? And some teams were already, if you remember at the Senior Bowl, they were having him cover receivers. So in the NFL's mind, is he a straight-up defensive end? Could he possibly play a hybrid role, maybe play outside? Can we ask him to cover? I think it's a fascinating group of Penn State's potential draft class. We haven't really even talked about Michael Bennett, who's as solid as they come in terms of center prospects. I think he'll see his name called early. I don't know they need to see a lot from Michael Bennett, Greg. I think the tape after 3 straight years starting speaks for itself. But I'm with you. I'm excited. I would love. Hopefully, we'll be able to see Pro Day, but I don't think there's any guarantee for us media types to be invited on March 25th. I'm sure you and I will figure a way around that, especially with a Harrisburg High grad possibly in attendance. We're going to need to know how Micah did. Guys, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. I'm gonna make this bold prediction, Greg. By the time you and I talk again, we're gonna have some legit, official, firm news of what Penn State's spring practice schedule may look like, whether or not there is going to be fans, for sure, how many at the blue-white game if permissible. I think our next podcast is going to be loaded with Penn State football information. Can't wait to talk to you again, Greg. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in.